So my name's Beatty. I am originally from Texas, from San Antonio, 93 minutes away from Robb Elementary. And my family owns a business in Uvalde, and my wife is a teacher. And so yesterday's shooting has really affected me, and I did not sleep last night. And so I apologize if I'm a little all over the place, but I moved here to Utah in 2009, and I live 30 minutes away from here right now. So if anybody has questions about restaurant recommendations, anything like that, please, I'm more than happy to recommend. But after I graduated from college here, I went to work at a company called Podium, and I was there for 5 years. I was primarily a back-end engineer. And so my experience with Remix might be a little bit different from a lot of kind of the JavaScript community that has come to find Remix, because I found it more from a systems engineering perspective. And so this talk is going to be very much from kind of a high level, and so we're not going to get too much into code or anything like that. But after I was at Podium for 5 years, I joined a company called Neighbor, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I actually left Neighbor a month ago, which is a little bit awkward, but they were very happy to have me continue to speak. They provided a lot of the screenshots here. I'm still on very good terms with all of them, so if anybody's interested in working there or anything like that, I'm happy to refer. But just know I'm a month behind, so I might not be completely current with all of my information. So one of the founders of Neighbor, when he was traveling down to Paraguay, he left his stuff in a storage unit. And as he was traveling to the airport, he passed a ton of houses, and he was like, well, there's all these houses. What if I could just store my things instead of with a storage unit with one of these people? They could make some extra cash. I could save some money. And that's kind of how Neighbor was born. They raised VC money here in Utah and have since raised more from Andreessen Horowitz and other Bay Area investors. You might have seen billboards on the I-15 if you drove here, but I'm guessing most of you flew. But their original application was built by a dev shop. So it had a Rails backend, React frontend. In order to grow Neighbor, the original focus was on using that VC money to purchase ads. If you've ever searched for something on Google, this might look pretty familiar. Notice how much I had to zoom out the page to be able to get any organic search results there. But Neighbor, if you search for car storage near me, typically we are going to have an ad on that page. And that's great. But in order to build a more sustainable business and lower customer acquisition costs, we wanted to turn more towards SEO. And so you'll see we also have the top organic result for that query. And that was done by building what we call dynamic landing pages. So these pages are fairly similar to what you might see on Airbnb, where you will be able to see kind of some of the keywords that you might search for. You'll see a map that shows where different storage listings are located. You'll see pictures of some of those listings. And then at the bottom of the page, not pictured in this screenshot, there's also more information about the storage type. We support car storage, RV storage, boat storage, etc. About the area and about Neighbor, so that all of those things will be indexed by Google to be able to help customers find us. And so we have over 90,000 of these pages that are indexed, and each of those also links to other cities within 100 miles. And so it kind of creates this network of these dynamic landing pages that Google crawls. Well, here's the problem. Google does not love your client-side rendered React. If you search for React SEO, the top Google results are all going to recommend using Gatsby or Next to do server-side rendering. Now, Google says that they will crawl your client-side rendered pages, and we have seen that. But we also saw that when we switched to static pages with no other changes to the site, our rankings within Google increased dramatically. And so this was originally done using a kind of a custom-built system for pre-rendering. We had Puppeteer would scrape the client-side rendered pages, generate the static HTML for that page, and then store it in S3. And so for those 90,000 pages that we had indexed, we were doing this every 24 hours and generating those pages. And then we used Nginx in front of our React app. So whenever a request comes in, it would hit Nginx. Nginx would check S3 and say, hey, do we have a static page for this? If so, it would serve it from S3. Otherwise, it would serve our client-side rendered React app. And so this worked really well for Google. We saw our rankings increase. Because the speed increased. The user experience of the site was better because it loaded faster. But the problem is we had to create a lot of custom code to make this work. On top of all the pre-rendering logic, we also had to have custom logic to add back in any dynamic features to our static HTML. And so we were maintaining the same functionality in two places, and it became a huge pain to manage. And so after I joined the company, we started talking more about server-side rendering. And so this would potentially allow us to not have to render those pages every day. It would potentially allow us to have much faster response times and not have as much maintenance burden. And so I looked at different solutions for doing this. At the same time as we were moving from client-side rendered React to an alternate front end, we were also moving our Rails backend to use Go microservices. And so one of the solutions that we considered was actually using Go to render these pages. The one issue with this is we really wanted to keep our React code. And so there is a library written in Go that will render React code to HTML. But we kind of came back to the idea that we were trying to get rid of a lot of our maintenance burden. And we didn't want to have to basically maintain our own framework. I think that would have been terrible. Another option we looked at was Quick. Quick has, I feel like, become a lot more prominent in the last month or two specifically. I was looking at these options about 4 months ago. And so things have changed a little bit. You might want to look into this more if you're making this decision now. But at the time, what I was seeing from Quick was that they were very focused on performance, which was great. They seemed to be a very, very performant solution, very fast. The issue that I saw was that the developer experience was not as good. Their documentation was not as complete, and there weren't as many examples of how you might build something with Quick. And one thing about Neighbor is we hire a lot of interns. And so we wanted the developer experience to be really solid so that those interns would be able to hit the ground running. We also looked at Next. And Next is definitely the mature and proven solution in the space. I really liked that they can do static site generation, client-side rendering, and server-side rendering all in the same code base. I think that that's awesome. And so we probably could have moved our code from our Create React App code base into Next quite a bit more easily. The main issue that we had with Next was that as I was spending time learning the framework, their documentation is very focused on static site generation. And for our particular use case, that's not what we were interested in. They do work with server-side rendering, and I presume work well with it, but that's not what their documentation is focused on. And so that's kind of how we came to Remix. At the time, it was kind of this hot new thing. Had barely been open sourced a couple months prior. But one thing that I really loved was the focus on having JavaScript disabled. We've seen several demos of that today. And for having a site that Google will crawl, that was actually perfect. We wanted Google to be able to read our pages without having to run JavaScript to be able to do so. We also really liked that it was focused specifically on server-side rendering. That wasn't going to be any kind of issue trying to figure out how that would work. It was the primary feature. The downside that we saw to Remix at that time, though, was really just its maturity. Like I said, it had only been open sourced 2 or 3 months before. And so we saw that and thought that would probably be a bit of an issue for us. But in the end, I wrote up a decision document, presented it to my manager and to his manager, and we were able to come to the conclusion that Remix was the right decision for us. And if anybody's interested in seeing that decision document, I'm happy to share that with you in person. I don't want to make that public, but yeah. So once we had the decision made, we decided that we wanted to just go ahead and start copying over our React code. And we had hoped that would be the case, but it definitely was not. Moving logic from the use effect hooks in our components into loader functions was a little bit more difficult than anticipated, especially since we had several nested components that were making network requests. On top of that, we also had a UI component library that we used that it was referencing document and window in this code. And so without making pretty big changes, we weren't able to use that. And so we had to rewrite a lot of our UI components. On top of that, our React code base was using 3 different styling libraries. We had styled components and Sass and Bootstrap utility classes. And so we decided to introduce a 4th and get rid of all of them and use Tailwind. And then on top of that, we had a bunch of dependencies that were out of date. And so in the end, we ended up having to basically rewrite a lot of our code. We were able to kind of copy a lot of the structure, but the code needed to change. And one other thing was cookies. We had been putting our auth tokens in localhost, and that worked great for React, but the server can't read localhost. Sorry, not localhost, local storage. And so we had to make that switch as well. However, that was actually a good thing. We were able to switch to using HTTP only and secure cookies, which made it so that we have stronger security now too. One downside I will admit was that we weren't able to use the Remix cookie helpers because our server stuff was had its own method of dealing with cookies. We had to just kind of write our own stuff. And so it would have been kind of nice if those were a little more generic, but that wasn't a huge deal. One really nice thing is that we already had Nginx in front of our React app. And so kind of like what John was showing earlier with incrementally adding Remix into your site, we were able to just use Nginx to only route to Remix when you were hitting those dynamic landing pages. And so we used a rule that looked like this. If you're interested in the code, it's not super difficult, so I didn't think it was that important. But you'll just notice that we were passing through the locations path was where those dynamic landing pages were located. And so anything that was on the locations path, we would just proxy through to the Remix server. 2 things to keep in mind: make sure you also proxy through the build directory, or else your JavaScript's not going to work. And also make sure that you're also proxying through the query string at the end of the URL, or else your JSON loading will not work. Found those out the hard way, so that was fun. And then let's talk hydration. Hydration can be a little bit awkward. Third-party scripts in general, I feel like are still a little bit awkward with Remix. That said, if you have any third-party scripts that manipulate the DOM, especially before hydration happens, that can cause some fun issues. We were seeing things getting rendered on parts of the screen where they weren't supposed to be. And customers were reporting that before we noticed. And so if you can avoid Google Tag Manager, I highly recommend it. Your marketing team might hate you, but it's kind of a pain. So, and lazy load whatever you can. Any third-party scripts that can be loaded after the hydration has happened, it'll save you a world of hurt. So shout out to web page test and Henri, but this was kind of a demonstration of what our pages looked like after we made that migration. So on the left, you have our old React rendered page. In the middle is our pre-rendered pages that we'd been pre-rendering. And then on the far right is our remix pages, which you'll see were just slightly slower than the static HTML pages, which is to be expected. But we were able to get a 7x increase over our React pages. And so the performance benefits alone were huge for us. That said, we did see that there was a little bit of inconsistency there. So this is really hard to see, I'm sure. But the scale on the bottom goes up to 2.5 minutes, which is kind of sad. Most of our requests were returning within a half a second. But we had some requests that were taking as long as 2.5 minutes. And we still don't completely understand what was going on, what is going on. So this is after I added Datadog to our remix servers to try and understand what was happening. This is kind of a flame graph showing what was happening on each of those requests. We make 4 to 5 network requests for every page load. And we try to do those in parallel. But one of the things we were noticing is that the TCP connections were taking up to a second to establish connection. And we still have not figured out why. That might have something to do with the fact that we deployed a Heroku and don't have a ton of control over our network stack. But if anybody has any ideas on this, I would love to talk to you and hear any theories. That said, all we ended up doing is just moving that and caching all of those requests in Redis, which luckily for the type of page we were working with worked really well. So we were able to get most of those under 100, 200 milliseconds. That said, that only works after your first request. And so, well, I'll get to this in a minute. Another issue we saw with Remix is that it can be really hard to find answers to issues that you have. The Remix IDE for Ethereum, probably great. I've never used it, but I've seen it a lot in the Google search results. But on top of that, most of the best content still seems to be locked behind Discord. I love Discord for community, for chat, but it's really hard to search. And it's hard to find what you're looking for in the search. And so one other thing that I would love to see more in the Remix community is more blog posts and more content that Google can find, just to make it easier to kind of find answers for those issues. So I've talked about some negatives, but I do want to say that overall, the experience has been very positive. In addition to the performance gains, we've also seen that our team became a lot more aware of our network requests. Rather than just kind of being able to just throw in more network requests into the front end and not thinking about that. Of course, none of us have ever done that with React before. But we became a lot more aware of exactly what we were doing on our back end. We started to think a lot more about how will each piece that we add affect the user experience. And that has been a really big positive for us. Another thing is the developer experience. This was mentioned before too, but the Remix builds are so much faster than a Webpack build. We were waiting 4 minutes to be able to spin up our development server, and now we can do that in seconds. So in terms of next steps, like I mentioned, we've been having those networking issues. We're planning on moving this all to AWS. That might have already happened, but I'm not sure. And so Heroku is great for deploying kind of a first version, but we've moved all of our microservices to AWS, and so we're hoping to do the same with Remix. The other one that we're looking at is pre-warming our cache. So making it so that everything will be in Redis from the first request. And we can do that now by just hitting the endpoint instead of having to build a bunch of extra logic to do scraping and store in S3, because now it'll just store in Redis and we'll be good to go. So not taking questions, but if you have any, feel free to scan the QR code that leads to my Twitter. If you have any questions, if you have any thoughts about the issue we were seeing, I would absolutely love to hear from you. Happy to give restaurant recommendations, anything like that. But thanks to the organizers for putting this all together. Thanks to all of you for your time listening. So we'll see you.